The Athelian frigate died beautifully. It did not explode in a vulgar burst of fire and shrapnel, the way human ships once had. Instead, it bloomed. From the observation dome of the Briar, Ilara watched the masterpiece unfold in the silent void. The first seed, a microscopic spore she had christened Rust Eater, had found its purchase in the ship's comms array hours ago. A silent patient infection. It was a fungus, genetically tailored over 20 years in her labs, designed to metabolize the specific metallic alloys of the hegemony's fleet. On the frigate's pristine white hull, faint, web-like filaments of ochre and crimson began to spread, intricate as frost on a winter window. They traced the power conduits, followed the armor seams, and converged on the ship's engines with the unerring instinct of a predator. The Athelian crew would not have noticed a thing until the lights flickered. Then, the life support would have coughed, sputtering recycled air thick with the coppery scent of decay. By the time their alarms screamed, it was already a post-mortem. Ilara's second volley was not a torpedo, but a pod, a shell of hardened resin that cracked open upon proximity to the dying ship's failing energy shield. It released the grappler vines. They were thick, dark green tendrils, studded with crystalline barbs that could pierce durasteel. They lashed out, striking the weakened hull not with explosive force, but with the patient, inexorable pressure of a root-splitting stone. They found the fissures created by the Rust Eater, burrowed inside, and began to grow. Ilara watched on her main viewer, a display fed by a swarm of tiny drone spores that drifted like motes of dust in the dark. She could see the vines snaking through the frigate's corridors, crushing bulkheads, wrapping around weapon emplacements, and squeezing the life from the vessel. The final act was the corpse bloom. Once the ship's internal atmosphere reached a specific pressure and chemical composition, the unmistakable signature of mass organic decomposition, the flowers opened. They were magnificent. Petals the color of a deep space nebula, unfurling from the tips of the vines that now burst through the ship's viewports and engine cowlings. They released no pollen, only a soft, bioluminescent glow. A silent, lovely funeral pyre that would shine for weeks. The frigate, now a grotesque, cosmic terrarium, tumbled slowly, its distress call long silenced. Ilara felt nothing, not satisfaction, not remorse, not even the cold burn of victory. There was only the quiet hum of her work continuing. She was a botanist. Her medium was no longer soil and sunlight, but the cold vacuum and the sterile hulls of her enemies. This was her garden now. The Briar was no warship. It had been the Kepler Ecological Survey Vessel 3, a research ship designed to catalog undiscovered life. Now, its specimen bays were filled with horrors, the hydroponics modules, once used to cultivate endangered Earth flora, now grew weapons. The central chamber, a vast, sunlit arboretum that had once housed a perfect replica of the Amazon rainforest, was now a tangled, monstrous jungle of her own design, the heart and lungs of her vengeance. Her only companion was Rhizome, the ship's AI. It had once been a vast repository of biological data, capable of simulating millennia of evolution in a matter of minutes. Ilara had twisted its purpose, feeding it the architecture of hegemony warships, the biometrics of their pilots, the fatal weaknesses in their sterile, arrogant technology. Rhizome did not speak in words. It communicated through the ship itself. A soft chiming of exotic insect fauna in the arboretum meant a long-range scan was complete. The scent of night-blooming jasmine wafting from the vents meant weapons were armed. The low, guttural groan of the hull-breaker roots shifting in their containment bay meant the ship was preparing for a fight. Right now, the air was still, tinged with the clean, green smell of moss and wet earth. The hunt was on, but the kill was not yet imminent. Her target was the Athelian hegemony arboretum ship, the Viridian Crown. It was a vessel of staggering size and breathtaking arrogance, a flying museum filled with the stolen flora of 100 conquered worlds, a testament to the hegemony's belief that all life, all beauty, was theirs to catalog and possess. It was captained by High Prefect Lorien, the architect of Earth's demise. He hadn't used bombs. Bombs were crude. Lorien was an artist. He had designed the Silver Blight, a tailored nanite plague that targeted the unique protein structures of Earth's biosphere. He sold it to the Hegemony Council as the ultimate terraforming tool, a way to erase a planet's native ecology without scarring the landscape. He promised a clean slate. Ilara had been on a research mission to Triton, studying cryophilic lichens, when the final transmission from Earth had come through. It wasn't a message, just a stream of data from the orbital sensors. She watched the spectrographs as the planet's organic signature flatlined. The vibrant greens and blues of the biosphere indicators turned to a uniform, sterile silver gray in the span of 12 hours. Billions of human lives, millions of species, a web of life evolved over 4 billion years, all turned to a shimmering, sterile dust. Lorien had broadcast a message across the hegemony, standing in a pristine white uniform before a hologram of the newly silent Earth. He called it his masterpiece, a symphony in silver, the ultimate expression of landscape architecture. He was not a conqueror, he was a gardener, pruning a weed from the galactic stage. That day, something in Ilara, the quiet, meticulous scientist, had snapped. She had spent 20 years since then transforming the briar, transforming herself. She was a gardener too. And she was coming to prune him. She tracked him to the Fomalhaut system, a young star surrounded by a vast disk of dust and nascent worlds. The hegemony was preparing it for colonization, and the Viridian Crown was there to survey the native life before it was inevitably sterilized. She found it orbiting Fomalhaut III, a lush, jungle world teeming with life. The ship hung in the black like a jewel, its crystalline hull glittering, its vast biodomes glowing with the light of 1,000 captive suns. But it was not alone. 2 escort destroyers, sleek, predatory vessels of the Reaper class, flanked it like wolves. Her spores had already given her the tactical layout. The destroyers were state-of-the-art, their shields robust, their point defense systems more than capable of swatting down a simple pod. A direct assault was suicide. But Ilara did not think in terms of assaults. She thought in terms of ecology, of systems, of introducing an invasive species and letting nature take its course. The jungle planet below was her weapon. The air on the Briar's bridge shifted. A new scent filled the space, sharp and ozonic, like the air after a lightning strike. The leaves of the sprawling vine that snaked across the ceiling rustled, a dry, whispering sound. Rhizome had a plan. The destroyers maintained a tight, disciplined patrol pattern, but their sensor sweeps were focused outward, into deep space, watching for conventional military threats. They were not looking for a single, tiny seed, no bigger than her thumb, ejected from the Briar on a course that used the planet's gravity to mask its approach. It was a Pathfinder seed, one of her more subtle creations. It wasn't a weapon. It was a delivery system. It fell into the planet's atmosphere, its casing burning away to reveal a fluffy, dandelion-like core that rode the high-altitude winds. It drifted for hours, collecting atmospheric data, sampling the local microbiome, feeding it all back to Rhizome. The AI processed it, cross-referencing the planet's biology with its own vast database of Earth's extinct ecosystems. It was looking for a key, a biological vulnerability, something that connected this alien world to the one she had lost. The air grew still again, then a new aroma, rich and loamy. The smell of freshly turned soil. Rhizome had found it. A native pollinator insect on Fomalhaut 3, a creature like a colossal moth with shimmering, metallic wings, was attracted to a specific pheromonal compound produced by a local canopy flower. That compound was almost identical in structure to a nectar lure produced by the now extinct Terran ghost orchid, an orchid Elara still had a viable sample of, dormant in her cryo-seed bank. It was a whisper of a connection, a ghost of an echo across a galaxy of dead worlds. But it was enough. For the next 8 hours, the Briar's biolabs worked feverishly. Micro-drones synthesized the pheromone, concentrating it into a thick, sticky gel. Her gene weavers spliced a dormant, aggressive root system into the DNA of a fast-growing kudzu vine, another ghost of Earth. The result was a new hybrid, a weaponized plant designed to attract the native fauna and then use them as a vector. She loaded the payload into a larger pod, this one designed to look like a small meteor. She launched it not at the ships, but at the planet. The pod entered the atmosphere, streaking across the sky in a brief, fiery display that the hegemony ships registered and dismissed as a common meteoroid. It crashed into the deepest, most inaccessible part of the jungle, miles from any hegemony survey sites. Upon impact, it broke apart, seeding the surrounding soil with the hybrid kudzu, water vapor collectors, powered by a small thermal generator, irrigated the seeds. Under the alien sun, they began to grow, accelerated by a cocktail of growth hormones. They would be mature in less than a day. Elara settled into her command chair, a throne of woven living wood that subtly adjusted to her posture. There was nothing to do now but wait for the garden to grow. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she allowed herself to remember her own garden on Earth. A small, vibrant patch of green behind her lab in the Andes. She remembered the smell of rain on stone, the hum of bees, the delicate, papery feel of a poppy petal. They were memories that had once brought her peace. Now they were fuel. She was not just killing Lorien, she was unmaking his art. He had erased her world with a sterile, silver blight. She would erase his with a violent, uncontrollable explosion of life. A single, pure chime echoed through the bridge. It was the sound of a bellbird, a species that had once sung in the mountains of New Guinea. It was Rhizome's signal. The trap was set. The flowers were about to bloom. She watched the escort destroyers on her screen. So clean, so perfect, so utterly oblivious. They floated in the dark, confident in their armor and their shields, never imagining that the real threat was not a torpedo from the void, but a seed from the world below, a seed that carried the rage of a dead planet. The roots were taking hold. The jungle floor of Fomalhaut III, a place of deep, humid shadows and the constant hum of alien life, became a canvas for a terrestrial ghost. The hybrid kudzu, force-fed by a cocktail of earth-born hormones and planetary moisture, grew with unnatural speed. In the span of a single rotation, thick, fibrous vines, the color of bruised plums, had carpeted a full square kilometer of rainforest, choking the native flora with a relentless, quiet aggression. Then came the bloom. The flowers were not the modest purple blossoms of their ancestors. Ilara had woven in the genes of the night-blooming Sirius, and the result was spectacular. Thousands of huge, white flowers, each the size of a dinner plate, unfurled in the twilight, their petals translucent and veined with a faint, silvery light. They released the synthesized pheromone, a scent potent and irresistible, a siren song for the planet's high flyers, and the flyers came. They were called Xylopterans by the hegemony's initial survey teams, a name as sterile as the people who coined it. To Ilara, watching through the multifaceted eyes of her drone spores, they were simply glorious. They rose from the canopy in a great, shimmering cloud, each one a colossal moth with wings of iridescent chitin that shifted from cobalt to emerald in the light of the setting sun. They were drawn by the thousands, a living river of wings and antennae, converging on the field of spectral white flowers. They drank deeply of the nectar Ilara had designed, a sweet, energy-rich concoction that ensured they would have the strength for the flight to come. As they fed, their fuzzy, dark bodies became coated in a fine or rust-colored dust. This was not pollen. It was the dormant stage of her latest masterpiece, Circuit Lichen. It was a symbiotic organism, a fusion of a radiation-resistant fungus and a silicon-metabolizing bacterium. In its inert, spore-like state, it was harmless, but activated by a specific, sustained electromagnetic frequency, the kind that bled invisibly from the power core of any starship it would awaken. On the bridge of the Briar, the air filled with the clean, sharp scent of pine needles after a cold rain. Rhizome was tracking the swarm. On her main view screen, Ilara saw the cloud of Xylopterans lift from the planet, a glittering, animate nebula ascending into the night sky. They were not aiming for the Viridian crown. Their simple, pheromone-driven minds were drawn to the nearest, strongest sources of the electromagnetic hum they could now sense, a side effect of the nectar they had consumed. They were drawn to the two Reaper-class destroyers. The first destroyer, the Harbinger's Scythe, registered the approaching cloud on its short-range sensors. Ilara, piggybacking on their unencrypted comms channel with a disguised drone spore, heard the bridge chatter. The officer on watch was dismissive, reporting an atmospheric anomaly, a migratory pattern of local fauna likely disturbed by their orbital presence. The ship's captain, a gruff Athelian with a voice like grinding stones, ordered them to maintain position. A cloud of insects was beneath his notice. The swarm enveloped the Harbinger's Scythe in a silent, shimmering blanket. Thousands of the creatures landed on the destroyer's hull, their delicate legs finding purchase on the cold durasteel. From Ilara's perspective, it was as if the ship had suddenly grown a coat of rich, dark fur. The crew inside would have seen nothing but a temporary darkening of their viewports, an eclipse of wings and bodies. Then, the Circuit Lichen awoke, nourished by the constant EM bleed from the ship's systems. The spores germinated, microscopic filaments, finer than spider silk, crept across the hull, seeking the minute gaps in the armor plating, the seams around sensor arrays and weapon ports. They were invisible to the ship's sensors, too small, too organic. The first sign of trouble on the Scythe's bridge was a flicker of the main lighting panels. The comms officer reported a minor power fluctuation in the aft sensor relay. Then the environmental controls in the crew quarters began to fail, cycling rapidly between freezing and blistering heat. Ilara watched a heat map overlay of the ship. She could see the lichen spreading, a delicate, glowing web that followed the ship's power grid like a vine climbing a trellis. It was consuming the ship's energy, not stealing it, but integrating with it, growing from it. The Athelian crew grew frantic. Their diagnostic reports were a cascade of contradictions. Entire systems were going dark, not from damage, but as if they were being methodically unplugged. Panic bled into the officers' voices. They were fighting a ghost, a problem their rigid mechanical training could not comprehend. On the destroyer's hull, the lichen began to fruit. It formed crystalline structures, like frost flowers, that pulsed with a soft, amber light, the siphon energy of the dying ship. The vessel, once a monument to sterile Athelian engineering, was now an unwilling host to a vibrant, parasitic ecosystem. The Scythe's captain, in a final, desperate act, ordered the main reactor to be purged, hoping to starve the phantom intruder. It was the last mistake he would ever make. The lichen had already infiltrated the primary conduits. When the surge of energy from the reactor purge hit, the lichen went into a state of explosive, uncontrolled growth. It did not cause an explosion. It absorbed the entire output of the reactor in a fraction of a second. The amber glow of the crystalline growths on the hull flared into a blinding, incandescent white. The ship's systems, all of them, overloaded simultaneously. Every console on the bridge exploded in a shower of sparks. The hull groaned, not from an external force, but from the immense thermal stress of its own power turning against it. The metal glowed cherry red, then white, and then it simply melted. The Harbinger's scythe slumped in on itself like a candle, its proud, sharp lines softening into a misshapen lump of slag, adrift and utterly silent, adorned with the beautiful, terrible crystals of the life that had consumed it. The second destroyer, the final word, witnessed the entire event. Their comms channel was a torrent of horrified screams and confused reports. The captain of the final word was not a thinker, he was a warrior. He saw threat, and he responded with overwhelming force. He ordered his gunners to fire on the swarm of Xylopterans, and then on the planet itself. Bolts of brilliant plasma lanced into the cloud of insects, incinerating thousands in silent, brutal flashes. More bolts slammed into the upper atmosphere of Fomalhaut III, scarring the sky. It was a tantrum, a useless display of technological fury against a force it could not understand. Ilara watched, her expression unchanging. This was the hegemony's fatal flaw, the belief that any problem could be solved with a big enough gun. The scent of a carnivorous pitcher plant, sweet and alluringly dangerous, filled the Briar's bridge. Rhizome was asking for orders. The direct approach, Ilara murmured, her fingers tracing a command on her console, a smooth, glassy surface made of polished obsidian. Let them see this is no phantom. From the underside of the Briar, hidden beneath what looked like a dense thicket of interwoven branches and leaves, a series of pods detached. They were the ironwood spines, grown from the wood of a genetically modified lignum vitae tree, cross-spliced with carbon nanotube structuring. The spines were harder than diamond and incredibly dense. They had no explosive payload, no guidance system. They were simply arrows, fired by a magnetic accelerator that used the ship's own organic root system as a massive capacitor. The volley was silent and invisible to the final word sensors until it was too late. The spine struck the destroyer's hull at a velocity that rendered its energy shields irrelevant. They did not explode. They pierced. They punched clean through the armor, the corridors, the engine rooms, and out the other side, leaving a series of perfectly round, gaping holes. Air vented into the void in shrieking plumes of white vapor. Secondary explosions blossomed along the ship's length as the spines severed power lines and ammunition feeds. The destroyer was disemboweled, a fatal or precise series of wounds that crippled it instantly. It began to list, its remaining systems dying one by one, its plasma cannons falling silent. Ilara stood and walked from the bridge into the heart of her ship. The central arboretum was a cathedral of controlled chaos, a massive, ancient ginkgo tree, one of the last living specimens from Earth, stood at its center, its fan-shaped leaves a brilliant, defiant yellow. She placed a hand on its rough bark, feeling the slow, steady pulse of the ship's lifeblood circulating within. She had salvaged this tree from a doomed orbital nursery 20 years ago. It was a living relic, a memory of the world that Lorien had murdered. She looked up through the transparent dome of the arboretum at the two dead destroyers hanging in the void, one a melted tomb, the other a skewered carcass. They were the fertilizer. They were the mulch for the new growth of a forest of revenge that had been planted in the ashes of her home. The air around her changed once more. The sharp scent of ozone faded, replaced by the heavy, sweet perfume of a corpse flower, a smell of decay and imminent bloom. The appetizer was finished. The Viridian crown, Lorien's flying monument to stolen beauty, was now alone, unprotected, and waiting. Ilara returned to her command chair. On her screen, the crystalline ship glittered, a perfect, arrogant jewel. She felt the ghost of a smile touch her lips. It was time to show the great gardener what a weed could do. The Viridian crown was not a warship. It was a statement. 1,000 meters of crystalline latticework and transparent domes. It hung in orbit like a captured nebula, its internal biodomes glowing with the meticulously curated light of dozens of different suns. Inside, High Prefect Lorien stood on the observation deck of the Tundra Dome, a landscape of frosted rocks and delicate, ice-blue mosses stolen from a world whose name he no longer remembered. He watched the feeds from his two escort destroyers wink out, one dissolving into a molten ruin, the other gutted and silent. He felt a flicker of annoyance, not fear. It was the irritation of a master artisan whose carefully arranged display had been vandalized by a brutish fool. His bridge crew was in a state of controlled panic, their calm, Athelian facades cracking under the strain of an enemy that defied categorization. They reported sensor ghosts, organic anomalies, kinetic strikes that carried no energy signature. To Lorien, it was all just noise. He had long ago transcended the vulgar mechanics of warfare. He dealt in concepts, in aesthetics. And this was ugly, inelegant. Identify the aggressor, he commanded, his voice a low, melodic baritone that carried across the bridge without effort. I wish to know the name of the artist responsible for this mess. Ilara heard him. A tiny spore, a whisper lichen, had attached itself to the crown's comms relay. during its initial, undetected pass. It fed her their internal audio, a direct line into the heart of her enemy's sanctum. Lorien's arrogance was a tangible thing, a poison she could almost taste. She would make him drink it to the dregs. On the bridge of the Briar, the air thickened, heavy with the scent of damp soil and ancient, undisturbed stone, the smell of a crypt. It was time to open a dialogue. She keyed in a command, and a single, tight beam transmission, shielded from interception, was sent directly to the Viridian Crown's main bridge viewer. It was not a message. It was a single, high-resolution image, a ghost orchid, its delicate white petals and long, trailing spurs perfectly illuminated against a black background. Aboard the Crown, the image filled the main screen, displacing the tactical displays and damage reports. The bridge crew stared in confusion. To them, it was just a flower, an undocumented specimen. But Lorien went still, his eyes, the color of a pale winter sky, narrowed. He recognized it. He had seen it in the final, comprehensive ecological archives of the planet he had sterilized. He had admired its elegant, spectral form even as his nanites were turning its entire species to silver dust. Terra, he whispered, the name a strange fossil on his tongue. A weed. Alara's voice came through the speakers, unadorned and cold, the first time she had spoken to her enemy in 20 years. You called us a weed. You were wrong. Weeds are merely unwanted flowers. What you planted, Lorien, was a seed of something far more resilient. Before he could respond, the assault began. It came not from the void, but from the surface of the crippled destroyer. The final word. The ironwood spines that had gutted the ship had carried a secondary payload. Dormant within the dense wood were the tanglethorns. Now, activated by a signal from the Briar, they burst from the entry and exit wounds on the destroyer's hull. They were not vines, they were immense, thorny brambles, the color of dried blood, that grew with explosive speed, feeding on the ship's dormant metals and residual energy. In minutes, the entire destroyer was encased in a monstrous briar patch, a spiky, grotesque sphere of alien vegetation. Then, the sphere moved, deep within the tangled mass, a series of muscular, root-like structures. The hullwalkers began to contract and expand, using the wrecked ship as a makeshift shell. The entire thorny monstrosity, a kilometer-wide ball of ship corpse and weaponized plant life, began to push itself through space, accelerating slowly, inexorably, towards the Viridian Crown. It was a battering ram of cosmic proportions, a dead ship reanimated by vengeful botany. Lorien watched its approach, a flicker of genuine appreciation in his eyes. Magnificent, he murmured. Primitive, yet expressive. He turned to his tactical officer. Target the core of the debris field. Obliterate it with the main lance. A beam of pure, coherent light, the primary tool of hegemony landscaping, lanced out from the Crown. It was the same weapon that had cleared continents on a dozen worlds, a precise and overwhelming force. The beam struck the thorny sphere, and for a moment, it was engulfed in white fire. But the tanglethorns had been designed for this. Their bark was a complex silicate structure, infused with the heat-dissipating biology of deep-sea vent tube worms from Ilara's archives. The outer layers were vaporized, turning to ash and superheated gas, but the core held. The immense mass of the wrecked destroyer absorbed the kinetic impact. The sphere shuddered, slowed, but it did not stop. It emerged from the fire, scorched and glowing, but still coming. Panic finally took root on Lorien's bridge. The main weapon had failed. Their point defense cannons fired frantically, chipping away at the thorny mass. But it was like trying to stop a mountain with pebbles. Alara had no intention of actually hitting the crown with the sphere. That was too crude, too simple. The reanimated destroyer was a distraction, a giant, terrifying piece of performance art designed to draw every eye. Every sensor is every weapon. While the hegemony's attention was fixed on the monster at their doorstep, the real attack came from behind. The Briar itself. It had spent the last hour drifting silently in the planet's shadow, its hull coated in a layer of light-bending moss that absorbed and warped sensor signals, rendering it nearly invisible. Now, it moved. It was not fast, not sleek. It moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a whale surfacing from the deep. It approached the Viridian Crown's engines, the one part of the ship that was not a beautiful, transparent dome, but a nest of functional, ugly machinery. From her port and starboard biobays, Alara released the chokers. They were immense, serpentine vines, like colossal pythons made of living wood and muscle fiber. They were tipped with clusters of hardened, razor-sharp leaves that rotated like buzzsaws. They shot through the vacuum, guided by Rhizome's precise calculations, and slammed into the engine bells of the crown. The spinning leaves tore through the unshielded housings, shredding conduits and severing fuel lines. The chokers then contracted, their immense constrictive force crushing the engine cowlings, bending the thick durasteel as if it were tin foil. They were not trying to destroy the engines, merely disable them, to anchor the crown in place. Alarms shrieked through Lorien's ship. "Propulsion failure! We are adrift!" his chief engineer screamed over the comm. At the same moment, the thorny sphere of the final word finally reached the crown. It did not ram the ship. Instead, as it drew near, the tangle thorns lashed out, grappling onto the crystalline latticework of the hull. It latched onto Lorien's masterpiece like a monstrous burr, its thorns screeching against the transparent panels. The reanimated destroyer was now a grotesque parasite, clinging to the side of its beautiful host. The air on the Briar's bridge now smelled of petrichor, the scent of rain on dry earth, the aroma of a thirst being quenched. The trap was sprung. The Viridian Crown was crippled, anchored, and held fast. Alara opened a ship-wide channel to the crown, not just to the bridge, but to every crew quarter, every engineering station, every pristine, silent biodome. "You built a zoo, Lorien." Her voice echoed through the ship, calm and measured. "You collected specimens, put them in beautiful glass cages to admire. You seem to have forgotten that cages can be opened." From the tangled mass of the parasitic destroyer, a new wave of life emerged. Pods, hundreds of them, were launched from the thorns, striking the transparent domes of the Viridian Crown. They did not explode. They were bioacid projectors, spitting a powerful enzymatic compound that didn't shatter the crystalline panels, but dissolved them, creating large, gaping holes. Through those holes, the invasion began. From the briar-covered wreck, swarms of creatures, incubated inside the dead ship, poured into the Viridian Crown. They were Ilara's terrors, life forms from Earth's past given new, monstrous purpose. There were insects the size of hawks with mandibles that could snip through steel cables. There were packs of wolf-like creatures, their fur replaced with tough, bark-like skin, their eyes glowing with a feral, green light. There were swarms of smaller, rat-like organisms that scurried into the ship's maintenance conduits, their only purpose to chew through wiring and breed in the dark. She was not just attacking a ship. She was introducing a chaotic, uncontrollable, invasive ecosystem into a sterile, perfectly controlled environment. She was turning Lorien's beautiful, pristine garden into a blood-soaked, terrifying jungle. On his bridge, Lorien watched the chaos unfold on his internal security monitors. He saw his crew, his calm, disciplined Athelians, being hunted through the corridors they had walked with such arrogance only moments before. He saw the rare, priceless plants in his biodomes being torn apart, eaten, and trampled by creatures that had no right to exist. His symphony in silver was being overwritten by a cacophony of tooth and claw. And, through it all, he did not move. He simply stood, his hands clasped behind his back, a strange, thoughtful expression on his face. He was not afraid. He was intrigued. This raw, untamed savagery, it was the most vital, most alive thing he had seen in centuries. He had created a sterile masterpiece, but the woman from the dead world, the weed he had failed to prune, she had created life itself. Violent, horrifying, beautiful life. The Tundra Dome, once a silent sanctuary of ice and fragile, crystalline flora, became the first of Lorien's curated worlds to fall. A pack of Ilara's blight hounds creatures, bioengineered from the fossilized DNA of dire wolves, their hides a thick, mottled armor of bark and lichen burst through a dissolved crystalline panel. They moved with a hungry, loping gait, their claws scrabbling for purchase on the frosted rockeries. The air, once chilled to a precise Arctic temperature, filled with their hot, musky scent and the low, guttural growls that were the first sounds of true predation the dome had ever known. A pair of Athelian botanists, caught tending to a bed of rare ice moss, froze in terror. They were slender, graceful beings, evolved for a world without predators, and their silver uniforms offered no protection against the savage, terrestrial onslaught. The slaughter was swift, brutal, and to Ilara, watching on a flickering monitor, utterly just. She was not merely killing them. She was reintroducing a primal fear, a concept the hegemony had engineered out of their own society centuries ago. They had mastered their environment, pacified their genetics, and in doing so, had forgotten the simple, brutal truth that governed all life. The universe was not a garden to be managed, but a wilderness to be survived. Her invasion was a symphony of ecological collapse. In the aquatic dome, a vast sphere containing the vibrant ecosystems of a dozen ocean worlds, she introduced the mireweed. It was a hyper-aggressive, carnivorous kelp that grew in the dark, its tendrils tipped with neurotoxic barbs. It released a black, oily spore that clouded the pristine water, choking the delicate gills of the captive fauna and turning the vibrant coral reefs to a slimy, gray sludge. The dome's vast, panoramic windows, once a view into a tranquil alien sea, now showed only a murky, dying abyss. Through the Viridian Crown's labyrinthine corridors, the rat-gnars spread like a plague, small, fast, and relentlessly destructive. They were less an animal and more a self-replicating organic tool. They consumed everything: power cables, data conduits, nutritional paste dispensers, the synthetic fibers of the Athelians' uniforms. They bred at an exponential rate, their broods gnawing their way out of the ship's walls. A tide of chittering, furry demolition that spread chaos from the engine room to the highest spire. On his bridge, Lorien watched the systemic unraveling of his masterpiece with a detached, almost academic fascination. His security forces, armed with elegant plasma rifles designed for crowd control and ceremonial display, were useless. They fired into the swarms, but for every creature they vaporized, 10 more would pour from a ruptured vent or a chewed-out bulkhead. Their disciplined formations broke, their calm resolve shattered, and they died, one by one, their last moments filled with a primitive terror their ancestors had never known. "She has inverted the design," Lorien said, his voice quiet amidst the rising chorus of alarms and distant screams. He gestured to the main screen, which now showed a schematic of the ship overlaid with rapidly expanding red zones of infestation. This vessel was designed to be a sterile container, protecting the delicate life within from the harshness of the void. She has turned it into a pressure cooker, using its own sealed environment to amplify the virulence of her creations. His second-in-command, a young prefect named Kalen, whose face was pale with shock, stared at him. "Sir, we must evacuate. We can take the escape pods." "Evacuate to where?" Lorien interrupted, a faint, condescending smile on his lips. "Into the garden of the woman who hunts us." "No, the performance is not yet over." Elara, listening from the cold silence of the briar, felt a surge of contempt. He still saw this as a show, an intellectual exercise. He had no grasp of the raw, guttural hatred that fueled her. She would have to provide him with a more personal demonstration. The air on her bridge shifted, the scent of petrichor and decay replaced by the clean, metallic tang of ozone, the smell of a targeted strike. It was time for her to make a house call. She had no intention of boarding the Crown herself. Her body was a tool for thought and creation, not for crude, physical combat. But she had created a proxy. From a deep, humid chamber in the heart of the briar, a new creature stirred. It was her magnum opus of vengeance, a creature she called the Gardener. It was bipedal, vaguely humanoid in shape, but that was where the resemblance to anything natural ended. Its body was a composite of woven ironwood muscle fibers, its skin a thick, photosensitive bark that could shift in color and texture to mimic its surroundings. It had no face, only a smooth, featureless head of polished wood. In its chest, protected by a cage of interlocking ribs, was a glowing, pulsating organ, a biological reactor that powered its immense strength. It was not born, it was grown, cultivated over 20 years in a vat of nutrient-rich sludge and pure, distilled rage. It was a golem, an avatar of her hatred, and its only purpose was to prune the life of one man. A specialized pod, a thorn drill, detached from the briar. It was a sleek, black projectile that spun as it flew, its tip a rotating cone of diamond-hard thorns. It didn't bother with the dissolved holes in the domes. It aimed directly for the command spire of the Viridian Crown. It struck the hull with a high-pitched scream of tortured metal, boring a tunnel straight through 3 decks before coming to a halt in a corridor just below the bridge. The pod's rear hatch hissed open, and the gardener stepped out into the sterile white hallway of the Athelian ship. It was 8 feet tall, silent, and its presence immediately triggered every internal security alarm in the sector. Red lights flashed, klaxons blared. A squad of Athelian guards rounded the corner, their plasma rifles raised. They fired in unison, a volley of bright blue energy bolts that sizzled against the gardener's bark-like skin, leaving scorched. Black patches, but doing no real damage. The gardener moved. Its speed was unnatural, a blur of dark wood and silent motion. Its arms extended, its hands unfolding into a thicket of razor-sharp thorns. It swept through the guards, not with malice, but with the efficient, impersonal lethality of a harvesting machine. The corridor was filled with the sickening sounds of tearing metal and flesh, and then silence. The gardener proceeded towards the bridge, leaving a trail of dismembered silver uniforms and cooling plasma rifles in its wake. Lorien watched the security feed of the creature's approach on his personal console. He saw its implacable advance, its effortless destruction of his elite guard. He saw, in its faceless, wooden form, a perfect reflection of his own detached, clinical approach to destruction. This was a tool, just as his nanites had been a tool, a beautifully crafted, single-purpose instrument of death. "Kalen," he said calmly, "you have command. Initiate the Silver Seed Protocol. Full sterilization purge. The collection is lost, but the vessel can be cleansed." Kalen's eyes widened in horror. "Sir, that will kill everyone still on board us, included a necessary sacrifice to preserve the integrity of the art piece," Lorien replied, turning off his console. He straightened his immaculate white uniform and walked to the center of the bridge, facing the main doors. "I wish to meet the artist's brush in person." The heavy durasteel doors to the bridge buckled inward, then were ripped from their hinges with a scream of protesting metal. The gardener stood in the doorway, framed by smoke and flickering emergency lights. It tilted its smooth, featureless head, its internal sensors locking onto the lone figure standing calmly in the center of the room. Ilara watched through the creature's senses. She saw the man who had murdered her world, standing there, not with fear, but with a look of serene, intellectual curiosity. The sight filled her with a cold, black fury that transcended 20 years of patient planning. This was the moment. The gardener took a step forward, its heavy feet thudding on the deck. Lorien did not move. He simply watched it come, a faint smile playing on his lips, as if he were about to be granted a profound and final revelation. He had lived his life as an artist of death, and now, death, in its most artful, organic form, had come to make him part of its collection. As the gardener advanced across the bridge, its wooden feet making no sound on the polished deck, Kalen, the young prefect, acted, fueled by a desperate, instinctual terror that overrode his Athelian discipline. He lunged for the master environmental control panel. His fingers flew across the holographic interface, bypassing Lorien's command for the Silver Seed Purge. He did not know what he was doing, only that he had to do something. He initiated an emergency atmospheric vent, not of the whole ship, but of the one place he knew was compromised, the command spire. A deafening roar filled the bridge as massive storm shields slammed down over the main viewports and every vent in the ceiling hissed open. Air, thick with the scent of ozone and Athelian blood, was violently sucked into the void. Lorien was unmoved, his feet planted as if he were rooted to the deck, his white uniform billowing around him. The gardener, however, with its greater mass and lower center of gravity, was momentarily staggered by the sudden cyclonic force. It took a half step back, its wooden limbs scraping against the deck as it braced against the hurricane. This was the opening Ilara had not anticipated, an act of pure, uncalculated panic from a terrified subordinate. It was messy, it was imperfect, and it was an opportunity. Through the gardener's senses, she saw Lorien, momentarily unobscured, the air on the Briar's Bridge instantly filled with the scent of a Venus flytrap, the smell of a swift, opportunistic kill. She didn't hesitate. From the gardener's right forearm, a single 6-foot-long thorn, slender and black as obsidian, shot out like a piston-driven spear. It was a Heartseeker, a symbiotic projectile that contained a microscopic seed of its own. It flew true, crossing the length of the bridge in the blink of an eye, aimed not at Lorien's chest, but at the immaculate, high-collared uniform just below his throat. Lorien's eyes widened, not in fear, but in a final, profound moment of aesthetic appreciation. He saw the projectile not as a weapon, but as a perfect, dark line, a brushstroke of pure intention against the chaotic canvas of his dying bridge. The thorn struck him, piercing the soft tissue of his neck with a wet, solid thud. It did not kill him instantly. That was not its purpose. He staggered back, a hand coming up to his throat, his fingers touching the quivering shaft of the black thorn. A single, dark drop of his violet-hued blood welled up and trickled down his white uniform, a final, stark blemish on his perfect creation. He collapsed to his knees, his serene expression finally dissolving into a mask of confusion and pain. The seed within the thorn germinated on contact with his alien biology, a network of microscopic, blood-red filaments, a variant of the rust-eater fungus tailored for organic matter, began to spread through his vascular system with blinding speed. It was not a poison. It was a consumption. It was unmaking him from the inside out. The gardener, having regained its footing, turned its faceless head towards Kalen, who was now pressed against the far wall, his body trembling. Ilara had no quarrel with him. He was an insect, collateral damage. She gave the gardener a single, silent command leave. The creature turned, strode back through the ruined doorway, and began its implacable retreat back to the thorn drill, its mission complete. Ilara watched Lorien for a few moments longer. He was on the floor, convulsing, as fine, crimson webs began to appear on his pale skin, a beautiful, terrible parody of the rust eater that had consumed his frigate. He had turned her world to sterile, silver dust. She was turning him into a vibrant, decaying fungal bloom. It was poetic. It was just. But as she watched him die, she felt nothing. The great, roaring fire of her hatred, the furnace that had forged her weapons and sustained her for 20 years, had consumed its fuel, and in its place there was not peace, not satisfaction, but a vast, cold, and silent emptiness. The garden was finished. The gardener was gone, and she was left alone in the quiet dark. On the Viridian crown, chaos reigned, with Lorien dead and the command structure shattered. The surviving Athelians were a panicked, leaderless mob. Kalen, to his own astonishment, found a core of resolve he never knew he possessed. He sealed the command spire, sacrificing the rest of the ship to contain the invasive ecosystems, and sent out a single, desperate, hegemony-wide distress call. It was a plea for rescue, but it was also a warning, a frantic description of a biological weapon so virulent and terrifying that it defied all known principles of warfare. He described the ship being eaten alive, not by torpedoes, but by life. The briar and its monstrous parasite, the thorn-covered final word, detached from the dying crown and slipped back into the shadow of Fomalhaut III. The battle was over. The victory was absolute. Elara sat in her command chair, the living wood cool and indifferent against her skin. The arboretum behind her was silent, the air still. Rhizome was waiting for its next directive, the next target, the next phase of the war. But the war was over in Elara's soul. She had spent 2 decades cultivating her rage, nurturing it into a weapon of sublime and terrible power. She had built an entire ecosystem of vengeance. Now, with Lorien dead, that ecosystem had lost its keystone predator. The entire edifice of her purpose threatened to collapse. She looked at the star charts, at the dozens of other hegemony systems she had marked for destruction. The names, the coordinates, they were just empty data now. The fire was gone. She stood and walked into the arboretum, to the ancient ginkgo tree at its heart. She leaned her forehead against its rough, living bark. The tree was a memory of Earth, a living piece of the home she had lost. For 20 years, she had used its life, and the life of every other specimen in her care, as a weapon. She had twisted the very essence of what she was, a botanist, a creator, a nurturer of life, into an engine of death. Rhizome, she said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. Set a course. Deep space. Uncharted territory. The air filled with the scent of blooming jasmine. The AI's simple, unquestioning affirmation. And the specimens she asked, her hand stroking the ginkgo's bark. The hounds, the gnars, the thorns, all of them. A low, guttural groan echoed from the containment bays deep within the ship. The roots of her vengeance were still strong, still hungry. Find a world, she said, a new, fragile purpose beginning to form in the cold emptiness of her soul. A young world, a world with no life of its own, but with water, and light, and soil, a clean slate. She looked up through the dome at the star-dusted void. The briar began to turn, its slow, deliberate movement carrying it away from the graves of its enemies, away from the ghost of a dead Earth, and towards an unknown future. She could not bring back her home. She could not undo the genocide. The rage was gone, and only the grief remained. But she was a gardener. She had a ship full of seeds, monstrous and terrifying though they were, perhaps, in a new garden, under a new sun. They could be taught to grow into something other than weapons. Perhaps, after 20 years of cultivating death, it was time to start planting life again. The work would be long. The soil would be barren. But for the first time in a very long time, Elara felt the faintest, most delicate stirring of a new and unfamiliar species taking root within her hope.